There are patterns in life that do not begin in a single moment, and they do not end easily. They move quietly through time, repeating themselves across seasons, shaping outcomes in ways that feel almost predetermined. Among the most persistent of these patterns is the cycle of generational poverty, a cycle that does not simply affect one moment or one decision, but influences direction, expectation, and possibility over and over again. It is a cycle that conditions the mind long before it limits the resources. It teaches what to expect, what to settle for, and what to believe is possible. Over time, it creates an invisible boundary, one that is rarely questioned because it has always been there. It becomes familiar, and familiarity often disguises limitation as reality. Generational poverty is not just about financial lack. It is about inherited thinking. It is about internalized beliefs that quietly shape decisions without being noticed. It influences how opportunities are viewed, how risks are taken, and how progress is approached. It narrows vision, making possibility seem distant and success feel reserved for something or someone else. This is what makes the cycle so powerful. It does not need constant reinforcement. It sustains itself through repetition. Each time a limitation is accepted, the cycle continues. Each time a belief of lack is reinforced, the pattern grows stronger. Over time, it begins to feel unbreakable, not because it truly is, but because it has never been fully challenged. But what continues can also be interrupted. There is a moment where awareness begins to rise above repetition. A moment where what has always been accepted is finally questioned. That moment is powerful because it marks the beginning of disruption. It introduces the possibility that what has been repeated does not have to remain. Breaking a generational cycle requires more than effort. It requires a shift in understanding. It requires recognizing that the pattern is not permanent, that what has been inherited does not have to be carried forward, that limitation is not identity, and lack is not destiny. There is also a deeper truth that begins to emerge in this realization. Provision is not limited by the past. It is not controlled by previous outcomes or inherited struggles. There is a dimension of provision that exists beyond patterns, beyond repetition, and beyond limitation. And when that dimension is activated, the cycle begins to lose its power. This is where transformation begins, not externally, but internally. It begins with a shift in perspective, a refusal to accept limitation as final, a decision to see beyond what has always been and to step into what is possible. At first, this shift may feel unfamiliar. It may challenge long-held beliefs and disrupt established patterns. But within that disruption is the beginning of something new, something stronger, something that does not repeat the past, but redefines the future. Because cycles do not break by accident, they break by decision. And when the decision is made to no longer accept what has always been, everything begins to change. The same environment that once reinforced limitation begins to lose its influence. The same patterns that once felt permanent begin to weaken. And the same life that once felt restricted begins to open. This is the power of recognizing the cycle for what it is, not a permanent condition, but a pattern waiting to be broken. And once that recognition becomes clear, the question is no longer whether change is possible. The question becomes how far the transformation can go. Because when a generational cycle is truly broken, it does not just change one moment, it changes everything that comes after. Generational poverty does not sustain itself by chance. It is not simply the result of limited resources or difficult circumstances. Its true strength lies in its roots deep, often invisible patterns that shape thinking, influence decisions, and quietly determine outcomes over time. To break the cycle, it is necessary to understand where it truly begins. At its core, generational lack is a pattern of mindset before it is a pattern of money. It is built on beliefs that are repeated until they feel absolute. Beliefs about what is possible, what is out of reach, and what is realistic. These beliefs are rarely questioned because they are inherited, reinforced by experience, and accepted as truth. Over time, these patterns create an internal framework. This framework becomes the lens through which everything is seen. Opportunities may exist, but they are not recognized. Possibilities may appear, but they are dismissed. Growth may be available, but it feels distant or unattainable. This is how limitation sustains itself, not by removing opportunity, but by reshaping perception. There is also a pattern of expectation that develops. When lack is experienced repeatedly, it begins to feel predictable. Expectations become lower, not out of or choice, but out of conditioning. Effort is often focused on maintaining stability rather than pursuing expansion. Survival becomes the priority, while growth feels uncertain. This does not mean there is no desire for more. The desire often exists strongly, but desire alone is not enough to break a pattern that is rooted in belief. When internal expectations are limited, even strong desire struggles to create lasting change. This is why cycles continue, even when there is effort to move beyond them. Another layer of this cycle is decision-making. Patterns of lack influence how choices are made. Risk is avoided, not because it is always dangerous, but because it feels unfamiliar. Opportunities that require stepping beyond comfort are often rejected, while familiar patterns, though limiting, feel safer. This creates repetition. The same types of decisions lead to the same types of outcomes, and those outcomes reinforce the original belief. It becomes a closed loop where thought influences or action. Action produces results, and results strengthen the original thought. Breaking this cycle requires interruption at the root. Not just changing actions, but changing the thinking that drives those actions. Because without addressing the root, surface level changes will eventually return to the same pattern. There is also an emotional dimension to generational lack. It is not only about belief, but about internal resistance. Fear of failure, fear of loss, and even fear of success can all exist within this cycle. These emotions create hesitation, and hesitation limits movement. But once the root is understood, something powerful begins to happen. Awareness creates distance from the pattern. It allows recognition that what has been repeated is not fixed, that what has been learned can also be unlearned. This is where transformation begins, not by denying the past, but by refusing to let it define the future. It begins with a conscious decision to no longer operate from inherited or limitation, to question beliefs that were once accepted without thought, to challenge patterns that once felt permanent. As this shift begins, the internal framework starts to change. New beliefs begin to form. Expectations begin to rise. Possibilities that once felt distant begin to feel closer. And with this shift in thinking comes a shift in action. Decisions become more intentional. Opportunities become more visible. Risk becomes more calculated rather than avoided. And slowly the pattern begins to weaken. Because once the root is disrupted, the cycle can no longer sustain itself in the same way. And when the root changes, everything that grows from it begins to change as well. There is a point where understanding the cycle is no longer enough, and a deeper shift becomes necessary, a shift that moves beyond awareness into activation. This is where the power of a psalm of provision begins to take its place. It is not simply a collection of words or a passive expression of hope. It is a deliberate alignment, a focused declaration that redirects the internal state from limitation toward supply, from scarcity toward abundance. A psalm of provision carries weight because it engages both belief and direction. It speaks directly to the internal patterns that have been formed over time and begins to reshape them. Where there was once expectation of lack, it introduces expectation of supply. Where there was once hesitation, it establishes confidence. It becomes a consistent reinforcement of a new reality, one that is not defined by past cycles, but by present alignment. This kind of activation is powerful because it does not wait for circumstances to change before shifting perspective. It begins within. It starts by establishing a new foundation of thought, one that no longer agrees with limitation. And as this foundation strengthens, it begins to influence every layer of thinking, every decision, and every action that follows. A psalm of provision works by repetition, but, or, not the kind of repetition that sustains limitation. It is a repetition that builds strength. Each declaration reinforces a new belief. Each alignment weakens the old pattern. Over time, this consistent reinforcement creates a shift that becomes difficult to reverse. What once felt unnatural begins to feel normal. What once felt distant begins to feel expected. There is also a clarity that comes with this process. When the mind is no longer occupied with thoughts of lack, it becomes open to recognizing opportunity. When expectation changes, perception changes. What was once overlooked becomes visible. What was once dismissed becomes worth pursuing. This is how internal activation begins to create external movement. Provision in this sense is not only about receiving, it is about alignment with a flow that already exists. It is about positioning internally in a way that allows that flow to be recognized and accessed. When alignment is absent, even available opportunities may go unnoticed. But when alignment is present, even small openings become pathways for growth. Another dimension of this activation is consistency. A single moment of clarity is powerful, but sustained transformation requires repetition. The patterns that created generational lack were built over time, and they are dismantled through consistent renewal. Each time a psalm of provision is activated, it strengthens the new direction and weakens the old one. As this process continues, something begins to shift at a deeper level. The sense of limitation starts to dissolve. The expectation of struggle begins to fade. In its place, there is a growing confidence that provision is not distant but accessible. That supply is not rare but available. That growth is not restricted but possible. This is where the transformation becomes visible. Decisions begin to reflect the new belief system. Actions begin to align with a greater vision. Movement becomes more intentional, more focused, and more effective. And as these changes take place, outcomes begin to follow. What makes a psalm of provision so powerful is that it does not rely on external validation to begin working. It starts within, creating a shift that eventually influences everything outside. It builds a new pattern, one that no longer supports lack, but sustains growth and expansion. And once this pattern begins to take hold, the cycle that once felt permanent begins to weaken. Because when provision is activated internally, it becomes visible externally. Breaking a generational cycle requires more than recognizing it and declaring a new direction. It demands a complete rewiring of the mind. Because the mind is where patterns live, where beliefs are reinforced, and where decisions are formed long before they are acted upon. If the mind remains unchanged, the cycle will find a way to continue. Even under new conditions, rewiring the mind is not a surface adjustment. It is a deliberate and continuous process of replacing old patterns with new ones. Patterns of scarcity, limitation, and doubt must be confronted and removed, not gradually ignored. These patterns have been reinforced over time, which means they will not disappear without intentional effort. They must be replaced with thoughts that align with growth, provision, and expansion. This process begins with awareness. Every thought that reinforces limitation must be recognized for what it is: not truth, but conditioning. Once recognized, it can be challenged. And once challenged, it can be replaced. This is how the mind begins to shift from automatic limitation to intentional alignment. There is also a need for consistency in this transformation. A single moment of positive thinking is not enough to override years of ingrained patterns. The mind must be trained through repetition. New thoughts must be reinforced until they become natural. What once felt unfamiliar must become familiar. This is how rewiring takes place, through steady, repeated alignment with a new way of thinking. As the mind begins to change, perception begins to change as well. Situations that once seemed limiting begin to reveal new possibilities. Challenges that once felt overwhelming begin to feel manageable. The same environment begins to look different, not because it has changed, but because the lens through which it is viewed has been transformed. This shift in perception directly influences action. When the mind no longer operates from fear or limitation, decisions become more confident and intentional. Opportunities are no longer avoided, they are evaluated. Risks are no longer feared, they are understood. Movement becomes strategic rather than reactive. There is also a strengthening of internal belief that takes place. As new patterns are reinforced, confidence begins to grow, not based on external validation, but on internal clarity. This confidence allows for consistency in action, which is essential for breaking long-standing cycles. Rewiring, or the mind also removes internal resistance. Resistance often comes from conflict between old beliefs and new desires. When the mind is fully aligned with abundance, that conflict begins to disappear. Actions no longer feel forced. Movement no longer feels uncertain. There is a sense of direction that replaces hesitation. Another important aspect of this transformation is identity. Over time, repeated thoughts shape how identity is perceived. When the mind operates from limitation, identity becomes tied to that limitation. But as the mind is rewired, identity begins to shift. It is no longer connected to lack, but to growth. No longer defined by past patterns, but by present alignment. This shift in identity is powerful because it changes what is considered normal. What once felt out of reach begins to feel attainable. What once felt unrealistic begins to feel expected. This is how the cycle is broken, not only by changing actions, but by redefining what is believed to be possible. This process continues, the mind becomes a source of strength rather than limitation. It begins to support growth instead of resisting it. It reinforces progress instead of repeating the past. And with this new foundation, every decision, every action, and every outcome begins to align with a different direction. Because when the mind is rewired, the cycle loses its control. There is a dimension of provision that operates beyond effort alone. It is not disconnected from action, but it is not limited by action either. It is a flow, a higher alignment, where supply, opportunity, and direction begin to move together in a way that feels natural rather than forced. This is the point where life shifts from constant struggle into intentional movement. Alignment is the key to entering this flow. It is not about doing more, but about being positioned correctly internally and externally. When thoughts, beliefs, and actions are in harmony with growth and expansion, resistance begins to fade. Internal conflict that once slowed progress disappears, and in its place comes clarity and direction. This alignment starts within. It begins with a mindset that no longer agrees with limitation, a belief system that expects provision rather than questions it. When this internal alignment is established, it begins to influence how opportunities are seen and how decisions are made. Opportunities often exist long before they are recognized. But when the mind is clouded by limitation, they remain unseen. Alignment sharpens perception. It allows opportunities to stand out clearly. What was once overlooked becomes obvious. What once felt uncertain begins to feel like a clear next step. There is also a shift in timing. When alignment is present, actions become more precise. Decisions are made with clarity instead of hesitation. This reduces wasted effort and creates a more direct path forward. Progress becomes more efficient, not because there is less work, but because the work is guided by clarity rather than confusion. Another aspect of this flow is momentum. When alignment is achieved, movement becomes consistent. Each step forward builds on the last. There is no constant need to restart or recover from setbacks caused by misalignment. Instead, progress becomes steady and cumulative. This momentum creates confidence, not the kind that depends on external results, but one that grows from internal consistency. It reinforces the belief that movement is no longer blocked, that progress is no longer accidental, that direction is no longer uncertain. There is also a sense of ease that begins to develop. Not ease in the sense of absence of effort, but ease in the sense of reduced resistance. Effort is still required, but it is no longer met with invisible opposition. It produces results more directly, creating a cycle of reinforcement that strengthens alignment even further. As this flow continues, provision begins to show up in different forms. It may appear as opportunities, ideas, connections, or clarity at the right moment. These are not random occurrences, they are the result of alignment. When the internal state is clear, it becomes easier to recognize and act on what is already available. This is where life begins to feel different. The constant struggle to force progress is replaced by a steady movement that feels supported. Decisions no longer feel heavy. Direction no longer feels uncertain. There is a growing sense that everything is beginning to work together rather than against. Alignment also brings sustainability. Progress is no longer temporary or dependent on isolated effort. It becomes part of a consistent pattern, a new cycle that replaces the old one. A cycle of growth, expansion, and forward movement. And this is the turning point. When alignment is achieved, the cycle of lack loses its foundation. It can no longer sustain itself in the presence of clarity, confidence, and consistent movement. Because when life is aligned, stuck, with a higher flow of provision, limitation no longer defines the outcome. A cycle only continues because it repeats. It survives through consistency, consistent thoughts, consistent decisions, and consistent patterns that reinforce the same outcomes again and again. To break a generational cycle permanently, it is not enough to interrupt it once. It must be replaced with something stronger, something more consistent, and something that no longer allows the old pattern to return. Permanent change requires commitment, not a temporary shift driven by emotion, but a sustained decision that holds its ground over time. Because the patterns that created generational poverty were not formed overnight, and they will not disappear through a single moment of awareness. They must be dismantled intentionally and replaced deliberately. This begins with refusing to return to old thinking. The mind will often attempt to fall back into familiar patterns, especially in moments of pressure or uncertainty. Thoughts of limitation may try to resurface. Old beliefs may attempt to re-establish themselves. But this is where consistency becomes critical. Every time the old pattern tries to return, it must be confronted and replaced. This is how a new standard is built, not by avoiding challenges, but by responding to them differently. Each decision to reject limitations strengthens the new direction. Each action aligned with growth reinforces the new pattern. Over time, this repetition creates stability, and that stability transforms into permanence. There is also a need to establish new habits, because habits are the structure through which patterns are maintained. If old habits remain in place, they will continue to produce familiar outcomes. But when new habits are formed, habits of growth, discipline, awareness, and intentional action, they begin to shape a different future. These habits do more than create change in the present. They create a foundation for what follows. Because breaking a generational cycle is not only about personal transformation, it is about creating a new pattern that replaces the old one entirely. A pattern that no longer carries limitation, but instead carries growth and expansion forward. Another important element of permanence is identity. Change becomes lasting when it is no longer seen as something being attempted, but as something that has become part of identity. When the mindset shifts from trying to break the cycle to no longer being part of that cycle, the transformation deepens. This identity shift removes internal conflict. It eliminates the tension between old patterns and new desires. It creates alignment where once there was resistance, and in that alignment, consistency becomes natural rather than forced. There is also resilience that develops through this process. Challenges will still arise, but they no longer have the power to pull everything back into old patterns. Instead of triggering regression, they become moments of reinforcement, opportunities to strengthen the new direction. As this continues, the cycle begins to lose its influence completely. What once felt dominant becomes distant. What once felt permanent becomes irrelevant. The patterns that once shaped outcomes no longer have the same control. And in their place, something new is established, as cycle of growth. A cycle where each step forward builds on the last. where progress is sustained, not temporary, where outcomes reflect intention rather than inheritance. This is how a cycle is not just broken, but replaced. Not weakened temporarily, but removed completely. Because permanence is not achieved through a single breakthrough, it is built through consistent alignment, repeated decisions, and a commitment that does not fade. This is the moment where everything comes down to a decision, not a vague intention, not a passing thought, but a clear and deliberate choice. A choice to no longer accept limitation as a permanent condition. A choice to stop repeating what has been repeated for generations. A choice to activate something greater and step fully into it. Waiting will not break the cycle. Hoping will not rewrite the pattern. The shift begins when a firm decision is made to act differently, to think differently, and to align with a new direction without hesitation. Because every delay allows the old pattern to remain in place, and every moment of inaction reinforces what is meant to be broken. Activation begins with declaration. A strong, intentional alignment of thought and belief with provision rather than lack. This is not empty repetition, it is a conscious redirection of the mind. Each declaration weakens the old narrative and strengthens the new one. Each moment of alignment builds momentum toward transformation. There is power in what is consistently affirmed. Over time, repeated declarations reshape internal belief. They redefine what is expected. They replace uncertainty with clarity and hesitation, or confidence. This is how internal activation begins to influence external reality. But declaration alone is not enough. It must be followed by aligned action. Every step taken in alignment with growth reinforces the new cycle. Every decision that reflects expansion weakens the old one. Action gives form to belief, and consistent action turns intention into reality. There is also a need for persistence. The old cycle was sustained through repetition, and the new one must be established the same way, not through occasional effort, but through continuous alignment, through daily decisions that move in the direction of growth, even when progress feels slow. This persistence builds strength. It creates stability. It transforms temporary change into lasting transformation. And as this continues, something powerful begins to happen. The new pattern becomes the dominant one. At that point, abundance is no longer something being pursued. It becomes something that is lived. Provision is no longer something hoped for. It becomes something that is expected. The internal shift becomes so strong that the external results begin to follow naturally. There is also a responsibility that comes with this transformation. Breaking a generational cycle is not only about personal change, it is about establishing a new standard. A standard that replaces limitation with possibility, lack with provision, and restriction with growth. This is where the impact extends beyond the present. Because when a cycle is truly broken, it does not return. It is replaced by something new, something stronger, something better, something that carries forward in a completely different direction. The call is clear. Activate the shift. Declare the new direction. Align every thought, every belief, and every action with abundance. Refuse to return to what has already been broken. Commit fully to what is being built. Let this be the moment where the cycle ends. Let this be the point where provision begins to flow, or without resistance. Let this be the decision that changes everything that follows. Because once the shift is made, generational lack loses its power and generational abundance begins.